Hi everyone, Hare Krishna, please accept my humble obeisances, all glories to Shri Guru and Shri Gauranga, or Dandavat Pranams, whichever mat you happen to be in. I want to talk a bit today about Britain's first Hare Krishna movement, 1933 to 1937. For several months, or even a year possibly, I've been putting various comments, articles, photos on this Facebook page about what the Hare Krishna movement or what the devotees were doing in Britain in the 1930s. Now, most people are of the view, understandably, that the birth of the Hare Krishna movement happened in the 1960s in Britain and in the West, in the United States. 1960s liberal sexual revolution. People were doing new things, trying new things, and people were keen on some spiritual awakening. But actually, as some of you might be aware, the Hare Krishna movement dabbled in British culture in the 1930s. A number of you have been in touch with me to ask about information about that time, in terms of, what were the devotees doing, what were the disciples of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur up to in Britain, and how many were meeting, what programs were happening. And the fact that it's going to be several more months before my book comes out with a whole big chapter on the history of Gaudiya Vaishnavism in the UK. I wanted to talk a bit about it because I've found out lots of some even more fascinating things recently through reading articles and doing research, finding information about the devotees of Lord Krishna, Gaudiya Vaishnavism in Britain in the 1930s. So I've entitled this little talk, Britain's First Hare Krishna Movement, 1933 to 1937. And in case there are any listeners out there that know a bit more than me, I haven't forgotten two other individuals. I haven't forgotten Ronald Nixon, who became Sri Krishna Prem in the 1920s in India. He was an Englishman who went to India, who I've talked about previously on this page. I'm not including him in this talk today because he wasn't in 1930s Britain. And I'm also not including in this short talk Baba Premananda Bharati, who was a devotee, a Gaudiya Vaishnava devotee who came to the West, and he came to London in 1902 and got a job with a newspaper printing. He was actually one of the national newspapers. He got a job as a journalist temporarily. I've forgotten which one it was, but he then went on to America in the 1910s after that. So I'm not talking about them today. They will be included in the book very briefly, brief mentions. But I'm talking about 1930s Britain. Before I talk about the devotees, I want to cast our minds back, not that any of us were necessarily in these bodies or alive in the 1930s, to what was happening in India in the 1930s and what was happening in Britain in the 1930s. So in India, there was a rising movement for independence. India didn't gain its independence until 1947, but imagine the late 20s, the early 30s in India. There was a very strong growing movement for independence. If you look at A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada and also Shri Maharaj, both of those disciples of Bhakti Sarangamaraj Saraswati Thakur, they both dabbled, got involved briefly with Gandhi's independence movement. And I'm sure a lot of the other young disciples of Bhakti Sarangamaraj Saraswati Thakur did as well. They were all looking for some fulfillment, and they got involved in the Indian independence movement. India was still under British rule. Britain was still ruling India as much as it could, holding on to India in finally until the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1947. If you look back at the history, brief history of the British monarchy, it was Queen Victoria's grandson, George V, who was there's a reason why I'm saying this. Queen Victoria's grandson, George V, who was the current Queen's grandfather, him and his wife, Queen Mary, were the first British monarchs to visit India. I think maybe 1911, 1912, they went to India on a massive parade to try and, rubber stamp and cement the British Empire's strength in India. So if you look at what happening was in India, there was actually two strains of thought. There was a one group of people who wanted independence. They wanted India to have its freedom. And there was another group of people who wanted to stay with the British. They liked, the British culture. They liked the richness of the West. one particular individual stands out because he actually took a midway approach, and that was Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Maharaj. He actually didn't take either route. He recognised that Britain was ruling India, and he wanted, as a lot of devotees do and Krishna conscious preachers do, he wanted to make the most of the opportunity that India was in. So he said, well, if the British are ruling India, we'll preach to the British. If the Indians are ruling India, we'll preach to the Indians. He also had a huge desire for Krishna conscious preaching in the Western world. London was the centre of the British Empire. Remember that Srila Prabhupada A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami was taught, and I'm sure most of his godbrothers actually were taught in British schools or English schools, Scottish schools in India. So there was a huge focus on going to the West to share Krishna consciousness. Okay, so what was happening in Britain at the time? Britain was the West was going through a depression financially. Hitler had come to power in Germany, and the Nazis were on the rise in Europe. And at that point, in the early to mid-30s, there wasn't war, and there was some kind of amicable relationship, certainly between the British government and the German government. So so relations were there. There's a point why I'm saying that. You'll see that soon. So Britain was on its way to war. Things were changing. Women had got the vote. Certainly some women had at the time, and things were becoming slightly more liberal in terms of the welfare system, the welfare state. But Britain, to some extent, was still quite Victorian. So finally, it was the early part of 1933 that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur chose which devotees he was going to send to England. And very similar to Srila Prabhupada's journey to the United States in 1965, there wasn't really a plan after that. Kind of, we're going to rely on Krishna and see what happens. There's no property that we can live in, or there's not much money. So 1930s, it was April 1933 that 3 devotees were sent from India to Britain to share Bhakti Yoga, share Gaudiya Vaishnavism, share the teachings of Lord Chaitanya. Okay, so and also it's important to note that the Gaudiya Mat that was founded in 1918 by Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was actually quite strong to some extent in India. There were 64 mats all over India, and Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was thinking, well, we've got 64 mats, let's now go international, let's go to the West. I've got an extract here from Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Vaibhava, which is a huge book, or collection of books written by an ISKCON guru, Bhaktivikas Swami, who did 20 years research looking at the history of Gaudiya Vaishnavism and looking at the relationship between all of the mats after Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. So in Sri Bhaktisiddhanta Vaibhava, it says, with Professor Sanyal's English Shri Krishna Chaitanya published on Guru Purnima 1933. So just to break down what I mean, Professor Sanyal was a disciple of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. He had an initiated name. His initiated name was Bhakti Sudhakara Prabhu. And he, we'll talk a bit about him a bit more later. There's a reason why, but he wrote a book called Shri Krishna Chaitanya in 1933. So Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur judged that the time had come for propagating Mahaprabhu's message in Europe. And on the 10th of April, this is 1933, his dream finally came true when Srimad Bhakti Pradeep Tirith Maharaj, disciple number 1, disciple number 2, Srimad Bhakti Hridaya Bon Maharaj, and number 3, Samvidanda Prabhu set off from Bombay for London. So that's a short extract from the book. So those were the 3 disciples that went, and I'm going to tell you a bit about them now, what they were about. So you first had Swami Bhakti Hridaya Bon, 1901 to 1982. Now I have heard some stories that back in the 1970s he did actually preach in some ISKCON temples in the United States. I don't know the full story about that because I've not looked into that, but apparently it didn't go so well and he wasn't invited back again. So this is a godbrother of Srila Prabhupada, Swami Bhakti Sarangamaraj Maharaj. So he was born into an Orthodox Brahmin family in West Bengal in 1901. And he joined the Gaudiya Math in Calcutta in 1924. And he was made a sannyasi then in 1925. He was very enthusiastic. He was a very strong preacher. And at the age of 32, he was sent to London. The second devotee that went was Swami Bhakti Pradeep Tirith Maharaj, 1874 to 1954. So he was the senior member of the group in terms of age. Now what's really interesting that not a lot of people are aware of is Swami Bhakti Pradeep Tirth Maharaj was actually a Harinam and Diksha disciple of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. He was a godbrother. He was a brother in a number of ways of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. He was a Harinam and Diksha disciple of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, and he was a sannyas. He was the first sannyas disciple of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. So he was devotee number 2 that came over in 1933. And then finally, the third one was Shri Samvidanda Prabhu. Now, he isn't talked about much because he wasn't a sannyasi at the time, and I'm not quite sure of his dates, but he actually stayed in London after 1937. I'll come to 1937 shortly, but he actually stayed in London, and he went to the University of London to publish a thesis on Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and that thesis wasn't then published until I think after he died. It was his wife that published it. So those are the 3 devotees that came over in 1933. Swami Bhakti Hridayabon Maharaj, Swami Bhakti Pradeep Tirtha Maharaj, and Samvidanda Prabhu came over in 1933. They managed to hire a flat or an apartment at Drayton Gardens in Kensington. So Kensington is a very rich, wealthy part of London, and they were able, through raising some funds, through securing some funds from India, to open a place there. Now, what's really interesting is, certainly in most of the devotee circles I've been with, amongst in the last 10 years, we're told that they didn't have much success. And of course, compared to the growth and development of ISKCON in the 60s and 70s, it's comparative, isn't it? There wasn't much success at all. But actually, they did have some success. I'm going to share with you now what some of those successes were. So, a lot of the success was down to one individual called Lord Ronald Nixon, the Earl of Zetland. He was the governor of Bengal from 1917 to 1922. And even though he had left India in 1922 and come back to England, he actually was quite fond of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And remember, as a minister in Bengal and India, he'd brought back some Indian interests. He'd written books about Indian culture, Indian food, and he was quite fond of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So thanks to him, the devotees, those 3 devotees, were able to go to various meetings. They were able to meet certain people. They met government ministers. They met the archbishops of Canterbury and York. And I have put this on this page before. They did also meet King George V and Queen Mary, the grandparents of the current Queen Elizabeth II. So they met a lot of people. They were invited to Buckingham Palace, and also at least 8 or 9 newspapers, national newspapers across the country in 1933 did write stories about them. They were headline news. So the Times wrote a story about the Hindu mission, the Yorkshire Herald, the new religion of unalloyed devotion. These are all some of the headlines that featured in the 1930s. The Yorkshire Evening News, Hindu spreads gospel of love. Another one, the Sports General, said, Hindu leader brings a new religion, unalloyed devotion and human love creed founded in 1486. So thanks to the Earl of Zetland, Lord Ronald Nixon, thanks to that link, that British Royal link with India, They'd met the King and Queen, they had met government ministers, they'd met the Archbishop of Canterbury, they'd met the Archbishop of York, they had been in several national newspapers. So that was 1933. The Gaudiya Mission UK, or the London Gaudiya Society, was founded in April 1934, so 12 months later it was founded, and their base was their apartment in Drayton Gardens, Kensington, and Lord Zetland did become the first president, so an Englishman with probably middle class, upper class upbringing. He did become the first president of the London Gaudiya Society, Gaudiya Vaishnava Society, in 1934, and Lord Lamington, another member of the House of Lords, became the vice president. So there's a Hare Krishna Centre in Kensington in 1933, 34, 35. In London, you've got an English president, you've got an English vice president who are members of the House of Lords. In Shri Bhakti Sarangamaraj Vaibhava, written by Bhakti Swami, it does report that about a dozen commoners, so white Western people, about a dozen commoners were regular attendees at meeting of the London Gaudiya Mat. So about a dozen, about 12 English people were regularly attending programmes at the Drayton Gardens base in Kensington in London in the 1930s. Then Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur decides to send a fourth disciple of his to Britain. He sent, in January 1934, Rasibahari Bhakti Jyoti, who was a brahmachari, and he sent him hearing upon the success of the first three devotees. So those devotees were writing letters back to India on a regular basis. Several letters were exchanged between those devotees and their Guru Maharaj, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. And Rasa Bahari Bhakti Jyoti was sent to basically help with handy person tasks around the temple. He was cooking, he was cleaning, he was helping to arrange meetings and various things like that. So the 90s are progressing on. Of course, we know that we're coming a bit closer to Indian independence. We're also coming in Europe a bit closer to the outbreak of war. The Nazis are growing even stronger in Germany. There were a number of trips back and forth between these devotees and India. So particularly Hridaya Bon Maharaj went back at least twice to India and came back. And in an exchange of letters, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur suggested that the German people were intelligent and articulate, and he suggested that they might try and go to Germany after as well as London to do some preaching. So they did. They went to Germany to do some preaching, and we understand that Hridaya Bon Maharaj did preach in German at the University of Berlin, and he held a number of preaching programs. I'm going to pause there on the kind of development of English Gaudiya Vaishnavism, because I want to talk about one individual that I mentioned on this Facebook page just on Sunday. So his legal name was Herr Ernst George Schluss. So he was a young man born in, I think, 1908. He was in Germany, and he was interested in philosophy and comparative religion. He studied comparative religion in Germany. Would have been in the 1920s, and he was sent. This is what's really interesting. In 1933, he was sent a copy of Shri Krishna Chaitanya. So Shri Krishna Chaitanya was written by Bhakti Sudhakara Prabhu, who was also Professor Sonal in India, a disciple of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. He wrote Shri Krishna Chaitanya in 1933. Copies of that book must have got to London in the 1930s, probably with those three devotees that went. Somebody in London then sent a copy of Shri Krishna Chaitanya to Ernst Georg Schluss in 1933 in Germany. He then wrote to the author of the book, Professor Sonal in India, who passed him on to his guru, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, who then wrote to George Schluss and recommended, before going to India to find out about Krishna consciousness, this was all 1933, he should go to London and meet the devotees. So quite a lot was happening, and it's kind of a bit of a whirlwind in terms of things going on. So Ernst George Schluss did actually go to London in 1933, and he spent about a year there. He didn't leave until 1934. Fast forward a bit later on, because I'm not really doing Gaudiya Vaishnavism in Germany. He went to India in 1935 on one of Hridaya Bon Maharaj's return trips, and he was given the name Sadandana Prabhu by Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. He is probably the first Western disciple of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur in 33, 34, and I'll come on to why chronologically in a minute. He then actually later took sannyas. He was given sannyas in 1945, I believe, by Hridaya Bon Maharaj, and he left Germany. He left India in 1961 and went back to Germany until he passed away in 1977. And he was preaching then in Germany, in Central Europe and in Northern Europe in the 60s and 70s. Interestingly, at the same time that Srila Prabhupada was also preaching in Europe. And that's kind of another broadcast for another day. And there's another devotee there called Premananda, who was an Austrian devotee, and together they wrote in German a book about Lord Chaitanya. So that's another whole thing altogether. So you go back to the 1930s. So you've got those four devotees now from India. You've got Ernst George Schluss, who became Sananda Prabhu. He was also in London as well for at least a year. And there were a number of trips between London and India in that time. So, where are we? Okay, so Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj actually then went back to India in 1935. He then stayed there and didn't return, but as I said, Hridaya Bon Maharaj took several trips. So what was happening? We know that there was at least a dozen devotees, or at least a dozen members of the public in London attending programs in Drayton Gardens. And we learn actually that even though the etiquette is, let me try and explain this now. This was kind of before the whole Ritvik movement came out in the late 70s, 80s, is that obviously the etiquette in Gaudiya Vaishnavism and Vaishnavism is that if you should not initiate someone else if your guru is physically on the planet. So obviously Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur didn't leave the planet till I think the 1st of February 1937. So for those years before that, when the devotees were in London, he was very alive and well in India. However, initiations were happening in London between 1933 and 1937. So who was carrying out those initiations? Well, we learn that the same process that Srila Prabhupada used in ISKCON, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was using in the 1930s. So there were the devotees in London were initiating Westerners on behalf of their guru in India. So we are of the view that there were about 7 Western initiates. We believe around 7 Western people were initiated. So Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur chanted on the beads. They were sent in the post to London, and most of the time it was Bhakti Pradeep Tirtha Maharaj who carried out the initiations on behalf of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. Now, just to explain, that's not a Ritvik ceremony. That's not a Ritvik process, which is something else completely different. Srila Prabhupada did that a lot in ISKCON, because up until Srila Prabhupada left in 1977, he was the only initiating guru in ISKCON, and he couldn't be everywhere at once, so he would often send tape recordings of his voice. He would send beads in the post, and then the temple president or the temple authorities in that country would initiate people or give people, the new name on behalf of Srila Prabhupada. So this was also happening in London in the 1930s as well, which is actually quite phenomenal. And there's even a record of it in Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Vaibhava. If I don't want to... Yeah, so here we go. So this is Bhakti Sarangamaraj, who I'll talk about in a minute. So this leads me up nicely to him. I don't want to take too long looking for it. But basically, we're told... here we go. This is actually what it says in Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Bhava. It says, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati did not approve of his disciples initiating during his presence. One of his first sannyasis had for some time disassociated himself from the mission and was doing so. When later he rejoined the mission, he offered those disciples to his Guru Maharaj, who again initiated them. Yet, as a pragmatic extension of his compassion, this is interesting, when sending preachers overseas, i.e. to London or to Germany, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Sarasvati told them that as his representatives, they should confer Harinam on deserving candidates. Thus, Srimad Bon Maharaj initiated 2 German recruits. So one of them might have been Samvidanda Prabhu, maybe not, forget I said that. Anyway, thus Srimad Bon Maharaj initiated 2 German recruits, and Bhakti Saranga Prabhu gave initiation to 1 woman in London. So that would have been 1937, probably. Okay, so this was happening quite a bit, and we are of the view, even though there's not much documentation, at least 7 Western people from London were initiated in the 1930s through some representative initiation process. So who were those 7 people? Well, unfortunately, I've only got names for 3 of them. So one of them was Howard Corbuth, who was given the name Krishna Das, and he is recorded as possibly the first Londoner to be initiated. Also, there was Hilda Corbell, who I'm trying to work out if she... So we're told about 2 ladies who took an interest in Krishna consciousness. One of them was Daisy Boatwell, who was the most famous, who became Vinod Vani Devi Dasi. And the other one is Hilda Corbell, who probably became Vishnu Priya Devi Dasi. We think they're the 2 ladies that are being referred to. Now, Daisy Boatwell is the most famous because she then didn't pass away till 1981. She left her house in Cranhurst Road in Willesden to the Gaudiya Mission UK, and there is now a temple, which is 40 years as a temple. To the Gaudiya mission. So she was the most well-known. Now, what's really interesting about her is if you look at the dates, and if you look at some of the literature from the 1930s in terms of the Gaudiya Mat and the articles published by the Mat, it looks like that Daisy Boatwell wasn't initiated, and this kind of throws a few things out of the water. She wasn't initiated until February 1937. That's the date. However, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur passed away or left the world on the 1st of February 1937. So even though we're led to believe she was a disciple of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, it could have been that actually she was in fact a disciple of Bhakti Pradeep Tirith Maharaj, which is not sure, and different articles give different dates. So now I want to talk a bit briefly. I want to move on to October 1936. So in October 1936, there were devotees in London. Hridayabal Maharaj was going back and forth. Pradeep Tirtha Maharaj had left at some point. We're not sure of the exact date. In October 1936, the 5th disciple, the 5th Indian bodied disciple of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, was sent to London to help the London mission for 12 months. So it's kind of like a sabbatical. He had a very energetic style and a dynamic style of preaching. He was very good at speaking English. So his guru sent him to London in October 1936 to help with the mission there. He also caught up with Lord Zetland, who was this very supportive member of the House of Lords, former governor of West Bengal. He helped him organise public talks at Caxton Hall in London. Bhakti Sarangamaraj was invited to speak at the World Congress of Faiths at Oxford University as the representative of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, talking about the Sankirtan movement, talking about Lord Krishna. And also, get this, thanks to Lord Zetland, he also went to Buckingham Palace like those 4 years before, and he met, this time, George VI and Queen Elizabeth, so the son of George V and the father of Queen Elizabeth II. So it looks like at least three members of the three monarchs, British monarchs, have met Gaudiya Vaishnavas. So he, 4 years after the first devotees, also met the king and queen at Buckingham Palace. So then Bhakti Sarangamaraj went back to India in October 1937. And that's pretty much it then. We have records of the devotees in London from April 1933 through to October 1937, various initiations, various events, various activities, talks, public talks, programs, a temple at Drayton Gardens in Kensington. So for 4.5 years, things seem to be happening. And then there's no record of much happening, certainly in the 40s and the 50s and the early 60s. We know that the first disciples of of Srila Prabhupada, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, went in 1968 to London. Mukunda Maharaj, Guru Das, Shamsundar, they and others went. So there's a bit of a 30-year gap. But based on the fact that Daisy Boatwell died in 1981, left a house to the Gaudiya mission, was initiated 50 years before that. She was obviously still active in Gaudiya Vaishnavism in some capacity in the 40s and the 50s and the first half of the 60s. So she was still engaged, she was still chanting, she was still preaching. And also, you know, don't forget you've got Arnold Korbluth, who became Krishna Das. You've got Hilda Korbel, who we think became Vishnu Priya Devi Dasi. So we've got a number of English devotees that were in England for several decades. So Gaudiya Vaishnavism, if you go back as far as the first individual I mentioned, Premananda Bharati, we can take Gaudiya Vaishnavism back to 1902, or in fact you can go back comfortably to 1933, which is almost 100 years ago, when you document and look at what happened. I've said this before, but I'll say this again: if you haven't been to the Shri Vasudev Gaudiya Mat temple in Willesden, please do go. You may not be able to go at the moment because of the coronavirus, but if you haven't gone, please do go. They're kind of like the real deal original Hare Krishnas. There's a lot of glorification of Vinod Vani Devi Dasi, Daisy Boatwell on the wall. There you can find out history about Gaudiya Vaishnavism in the 1930s there. I have heard, and it's been told to me by a number of different sources, that Daisy Boatwell was also an initiating guru. She went on to initiate others in the 60s and the 70s, and some of her disciples are still alive. They're all Indian people, people of Indian heritage now in their 70s and 80s. So that's kind of a brief history of Gaudiya Vaishnavism in the UK. And I kind of look back to 1937 and think that if war wasn't rising in Europe, if the Second World War wasn't about to start, would things be different? Would Gaudiya Vaishnavism have actually taken a foothold or a stronger foothold in London in the 1930s? If you look at the timings and history, you look at Srila Prabhupada, the founder Acharya of ISKCON, him going to America in 1965 was the right time. It was the right time in terms of politically, socially, what was happening in America. There was a cultural liberal revolution. People were into gurus. People wanted a guru. They wanted spiritual wisdom from the East. That wasn't really the trend in 1930s Britain. 1930s Europe was a completely different place. And I like to think, interestingly, if war hadn't been on the horizon, maybe something would have been different in terms of a stronger foothold for Gaudiya Vaishnavism in the UK. So that's a brief overview and overlook of Gaudiya Vaishnavism in 1930s Britain. The chapter I'm writing so my book's probably going to be several more months before it's out. I'm still writing it. I have started writing though, which is great news. I'm not doing any more interviews. I'm just devoting any free time I've got now to writing. But also in the chapter about Gaudiya Vaishnavism, which will be a big chapter. You've got those devotees, that devotee from 1902, devotee from 1921, you've got the 1930s, and also I'll be talking about Srila Prabhupada and his arrival in the UK in the late 60s. I won't be talking a lot about ISKCON's history in the UK because there's lots of books about that already. I'm kind of referring to some of the hidden gems that people don't know about. I'll also be talking about, get his name correct, it's quite late at night for me because I get up early. So Shri Bhakti Sarangamaraj, I've mentioned him before. He visited London in 1975, held some programs. He was a younger godbrother of Srila Prabhupada. He visited the manor in 1975. He was the youngest, I think the youngest of all of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur's sannyas disciples. He didn't pass away actually or leave the planet until 1912. He appeared in 1921. He was a boy when he was initiated by Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, and he didn't pass away until 2012. Did I say 1912? 2012. So he did come to London in 1975. In some of the biographies written about him, there's him going to the manor. We think he gave class at the manor, and he was very impressed by the number of Western devotees. In other words, to be completely blunt, the number of white English people that were wearing dhotis and kurtas and jumping around chanting the Hare Krishna mantra. So that's a brief overview of the Hare Krishna movement in Britain in the 1930s. There's still so much more information to try and understand and try and look through. For example, what I could do, what could be done is we could go to Drayton Gardens in Kensington and actually try and find the home or the house or the apartment, which was the first Hare Krishna temple in the UK in, it would have been early 1934. I don't think they got their apartment permanently till around March 1934, and then the London Gaudiya Society was founded by the devotees in April 1934. So that will be a fascinating thing to try and find that building, to try and track it down, and and really to try and discover, if it's discoverable, what the devotees, those Western converts, were doing. What were they doing in London after 1937? Did they continue to hold regular programs? Did they fall away from Krishna consciousness? Was Daisy Boatwell the only one that carried on till she passed away in 1981? Were there programs? Were there Namahattas in London in the 1940s and the 1950s and the first half of the 60s? So there's so many things still to be uncovered. If my book exclusively was about Gaudiya Vaishnavism in the UK, the history of it, then fine. But I haven't even got on to talking about the differences between the mats, even though it's in note form to some extent. So this has been a long update. I appreciate it. If anyone has any questions about the history of Gaudiya Vaishnavism in the UK, or anyone wants any information, please do message this page and I will attempt to get back to you. Thank you. Hare Krishna.